In Chapter 15, we turn to look at the ways in which monetary policy and what we call fiscal policy, that is the government's budget, can affect the macroeconomy as a whole. I want to start, though, by sort of talking about the role played by the Great Depression in all of this. The Great Depression, as we've perhaps talked about, as you read about, right, major decline in GDP, high and persistent unemployment, lasted a long time, over a decade. The Great Depression shook people's confidence in stable, continued economic growth. It also made them believe that the way to deal with these problems, when the economy goes wrong, is by a significant role for government in solving those problems. We'll come back to the Great Depression in a couple minutes and talk about what happened, but it's important to sort of think about whether or not that's really the story. Is the story really that somehow markets failed on their own and that the solution was found through activist government policy? So first, let's think about what a recession is. Recessions and depressions are frustrated expectations. They're not just intended slower or negative growth, but an unintended, unexpected, and therefore disruptive reduction in growth. And it's also not everyday producer frustration. It's not people making a product that other people don't want to buy, right? It's not that you introduced, Taco Bell introduced a new item on their menu and people didn't think it was very good, right? That's not what we're talking about. This is a widespread, systematic frustration without an equal number of pleasant surprises for others, right? Think about how the economy goes in a normal time. You might introduce a new product that doesn't work very well, but then there's someone else who introduced a product, didn't think it was going to go great, went great, right? So in normal times, those balance each other out. But when we're looking at recessions and depressions, it's widespread, systematic, disappointed, frustrated expectation. Sometimes we call this the cluster of errors. Why does everyone make the same mistake at the same time? Right, think about the following, okay? Suppose while you're watching this lecture of mine, right, in Muncie, we discovered in that 15, 20 minutes there were several hundred automobile accidents. Right? Cars just crashing into each other. Now, what would explain that, right? Even with this winter and spring, right? Snow and ice, no, that's not gonna get us hundreds of crashes at all at the same time. Did Muncie drivers just simply go bonkers, right, and just sort of start ramming their cars? No, probably not. And your first thought might be, well, maybe the traffic lights aren't working right? And what if the traffic lights stop working? What would happen? Well, if you've ever been in that situation where the power goes out, people tend to treat those intersections as four-way stops. That's unlikely to produce hundreds of accidents. But what if all the lights turn green both ways? Right? What if at every intersection the lights were green both ways? What would happen then? Right? You see a green light, you just assume it's red the other way. Everyone sees a green light, man, they're going through the intersection. Kabam! We get all kinds of problems. Right? Notice there, right? And what's interesting about that is everybody's making the same mistake at the same time. Not because the drivers are crazy or irrational or anything like that. They're misreading a signal. The signal is giving them false information, right? The traffic light is not telling them the truth, okay? And that's what we need when we find the cluster of errors that we associate with a recession. We need to find an economic factor that's affecting the economy in a widespread way. What's the signal that's breaking down? What's both a sort of widespread signal that might cause people to miscalculate and misjudge economic conditions in the future? The answer to that question is money and the interest rate, right? When the interest rate in particular does not tell the truth, it leads to just these kinds of errors. Think about it for a minute, right? The interest rate gives us a guide to kind of how much people are interested in the future versus the present. Suppose interest rates are really low, but that low interest rate doesn't actually reflect people's real preferences about the future. Producers will see the low interest rate and think, oh, people are patient, they're willing to wait, right? They're future-oriented, and those producers will gear their production towards the future. But if that interest rate's lying, people actually want stuff relatively in the present, there's going to be a problem here, right? Producers are geared toward the future. Consumers want the present. The expectations of those producers are going to be disappointed. Okay, we'll talk about how that might actually happen in just a minute. Okay, one other thing to recognize about recessions and depressions is that they reveal the mistakes that came before them. The recession is not the mistake. Right? It's evidence of prior mistakes. What's happening during a recession when there's unemployment and all this is we're trying to correct the mistakes of a previous period. It's the beginning of the process of correcting those mistakes. Okay? So let's think about the Great Depression, for example. A large number of mistakes. It took a long time to recover from. Why were the errors clustered that caused this in the first place? What caused the recovery from those errors to take so long? So we can answer that by first talking about how economies work when they're working right, when we think about the role of the interest rate in economies working right. Okay, and again, simplify the story as much as I can here. Okay. Suppose that the public decides it is more patient, it wants to save more, it wants more stuff in the future, less in the present. People let their bank account balance build up, they save more money in the bank, banks have more money to lend. To lend that money out, they lower their interest rates, right? Attract in new borrowers. Entrepreneurs see lower interest rates. They think, great, people are more patient. With lower interest rates, I can invest in projects that take more time, that'll pay off in a more distant future. Okay, and that's, which is great because it turns out that the public is willing to wait for that stuff. So as entrepreneurs do this, they take their time, they engage in these longer term processes of production, right? And the public is perfectly fine waiting for them. Down the road, right? In the short run, there's less stuff, right? It's because people are saving and waiting for the future. But down the road, we see expanded economic growth, more stuff down the road, more productivity, and so on. And people get their stuff later. We see a normal process of economic growth. But let's see what happens when things can go wrong. Okay. Suppose instead of the public saving more, the Fed tries to expand the money supply by conducting open market operations, like we talked about in Chapter 14. So the Fed goes out and buys bonds. It adds reserves into those banks, to the accounts of various banks. The banks now have more to lend out. How are they going to lend it? They're going to attract in new borrowers by lowering interest rates. Entrepreneurs are going to see the lower interest rates and think, wow, interest rates are low. I can invest in these longer-term production processes. People are more patient for the future. But we know that's not the case, right? Remember what started this. Unlike my first story a minute or two ago, this wasn't started by members of the public saving more. This was started by the Fed creating more money out of nothing. And that interest rate, that low interest rate that the Fed causes to happen from its open market operations is lying. It's not telling the truth about people's real underlying intertemporal time preferences, right? So entrepreneurs see that. They think, well, people are willing to wait. They start investing in these long-term projects, thinking that people want stuff in the future, but it turns out people don't want to wait. They want stuff now. And so the public wants stuff now. The Fed's been building, or the entrepreneurs have been building these projects that won't pay off down the road. Something's got to give here, right? It's like pulling two ends of a piece of taffy. Something has to give, and what gives is we eventually out of this get a recession. The boom, right, looks good. In the beginning, it looks good because the interest rates are lower, people are borrowing, entrepreneurs are constructing these projects. Everything looks great, right? But once they realize that they can't finish these projects because the resources aren't there, the public hasn't saved for the future, the public wants stuff now, there's not enough resources to finish these projects get abandoned, right? People get laid off, and we turn from boom into bust. We're now in a recession. I'll talk some more about what happened in 2008 in a little bit, but you can think about the abandoned houses that were part of the Great Recession as being a great example, the half-built houses, that were a great example of these projects that people thought they could finish, but turns out they discovered that they couldn't. All right, and so here we have again the boom turning into a bust. And as I said before, right, the key to this is recognizing that the bust is when we try to fix those errors of the boom. When the entrepreneurs realize that they've made mistakes and they have to lay off workers and abandon projects, that's part of the correction process. And if you want an analogy here, right, you can think about when people go out drinking, say on the weekend, right? You go out on Friday night, you start drinking, right? You're getting drunk, and it feels great, right? It feels like you're having a great time, but we know it's in a way a false signal. We also know eventually boom's got to turn into bust. You wake up the next morning, right, with a hangover, and you don't say to yourself the next morning, I must have done something really stupid this morning to feel so terrible, right? You feel terrible the next morning because of the choices you made the night before. And your body's reaction, your hangover, is your body's way of trying to fix itself after you put all that alcohol in it the night before. Again, that analogy roughly holds with economies. The recession is part of the correction process. Okay, so let's think about the Great Depression for a moment. Again, there's some discussion in the book, and I'm going to go pretty quickly. The 1920s, right, leading up to the recession in 1929, was, in the eyes of many economists, or some economists, an example of this kind of unsustainable boom, right, where the Fed was too aggressive, too expansionary, interest rates were too low, sending a false signal. People built up all kinds of projects. It turns out they couldn't complete. Once that turned into bust in 1929, and it's important to understand the stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It was an effect, right? The economy had already turned into recession before the stock market crashed in October of 29. And once that crash happened, all kinds of mistakes were made by the Fed, by the Hoover administration, that caused that bust to be very severe. So, for example, one of the things the Fed did was it allowed, in reaction to the turn to bust, the money supply to drop by 30% between 1930 and 1933. That decline in the money supply exacerbated what would have been a fairly severe recession and turned it into a very, very deep recession with, again, 25% unemployment and so on. Why did the thing last for so long, right? So that tells us how severe it was. Why did it last for so long? Well, there were other policies from the Hoover administration and from the Roosevelt administration that prevented the necessary adjustments from taking place. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, seeing replayed in our own time with the quote, trade war against China. Trade wars are never trade wars against other countries. Trade wars are trade wars against your own citizens. It's like pointing a gun at your own head. And the Smoot-Hawley tariff certainly helped to make the Great Depression last longer. So did things like higher taxes. So did things like the Hoover administration's attempt to prop up wages. There were reserve requirements were later increased, and the Roosevelt administration engaged in a tax on business and had many policies of its own that were prevented businesses from engaging in the adjustment they needed to do. All of these prevented the discovery and correction of the mistakes of the boom. So with that, right, the question is, all right, so what do we do, right? I mean, one of the suggestions about that story about the Great Depression is that bad monetary policy can cause problems, okay? And more generally, what we can recognize is that there are a number of problems that when government tries to make monetary or fiscal policy that we need to think about and recognize as we think about their ability to address the problems that we perceive in the economy. Let me say a few words about what's called fiscal policy. And this is the government's budget, the taxes being the government's income, government spending being its expenditures, and how do we use the government's budget to balance the economy. The old belief was, for a long time, that government should run balanced budgets. They should not engage in this sort of activity. But in the 1930s, the rise of Keynesian economics and other schools of thought in economics suggested that when an economy is in trouble, right, in a recession, it might be a smart idea to run a budget deficit. That is, to spend more than you're bringing in taxes. And so the belief was, and when the economy goes bad in a recession, we spend more, we engage in additional spending. We don't match that with taxes. We can run a deficit during the recession. The thinking was, if we run a deficit during the recession, we can make up that deficit with a surplus when the economy is going well. Economy is going well, we can increase taxes or reduce spending and offset that deficit. So over time, we'd have a balanced budget. What's the problem with this? Well, a couple of problems. One, hopefully you recognize already, right, is that, think back to Chapter 11. Are politicians going to do this? It sounds good on the blackboard. But from a politician's perspective, what's in their self-interest? They like to spend money. That buys them support and votes and so on. They don't like to raise taxes, right? Because that means voters are less likely to vote for them. So one of the things we might predict is once politicians were told it's okay to run deficits, they would find it in their political self-interest to run deficits all the time and very rarely run surpluses. And one might predict that what we would see is endless years of deficits and debt. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we've seen, and exactly for those reasons. There's been very few years since the 1930s and 40s that we've had surpluses. They've always been small. Debt is now over 20 trillion in total debt. Next year's deficit will be over $1 trillion. Right? We're deep in annual deficits and debt because we sort of took the lid off this and said, go ahead and do this, thinking that politicians would offset the deficits with surpluses. Right? But that was a big mistake. People didn't understand the kinds of ideas that we talked about in Chapter 11. So fiscal policy, right? It can be dangerous, right? It sounds good on paper, but right, as we said back in Chapter 14, the end of the lecture for Chapter 14, same with the Fed, right? Giving the Fed the power to do good things also gives it the power to engage in the policies that cause problems. One of the things that both fiscal and monetary policy face are timing issues, right? One of the problems is we don't know where we've been until it's gone past us. That is, we don't know we're in a recession until we're already there. The data that economists use and that the policymakers use is always backward looking. Okay. We also don't know exactly where we're going to. And one of the dangers of policy is that we can use a policy like, say, running a deficit during a recession, but if the timing isn't right and we end up running the deficit when the economy is doing well, right, we cause the economy to sort of spiral the other way. One of the key arguments here is that policy, especially monetary policy, is subject to what Milton Friedman called long and variable lags. That is, lags in the time gaps in the time it takes to implement policy. We can talk about at least 4 lags, maybe 5, but I'm going to talk about 4. Okay, there is a recognition lag, that we have to recognize that we have a problem, and there's a time gap between recognizing between the problem occurring and us recognizing that there's a problem. Okay, we can include, and whether this is a lag or not is often debated, we can include a data lag in there too. Then we have to collect some data about what it is that we might want to do. A third lag is the time it takes to engage in decision making. The Fed has to decide what to do, or Congress has to decide whether it will pass a stimulus program. That takes time for them to make those decisions. Right? Then the actual thing has to be implemented. So we've decided what to do. It takes time to actually put it into implementation. There's another lag. And finally, an effectiveness lag. Even once the stimulus or the monetary expansion or whatever is implemented, how long until it actually affects the money supply, interest rates, and all the other variables that we think are important? What Friedman argued is that could be a year, maybe 18 months. And by the time those actually, the policy takes effect, the problem you're trying to solve might be gone and the economy's doing well, and then you cause the economy to go the wrong way. And conversely, right, if you adopt a policy when you think the economy is healthy, turns out it doesn't have an effect until the economy is in trouble, you might cause the dip in the economy to be worse. You might cause the recession to be worse. So this idea of being not counter-cyclical, that is offsetting the economy, but being pro-cyclical, that making the economy be more variable, that's the danger of these lags and the danger that Friedman pointed out. Okay, so one other thing to think about here too is we think about fiscal policy. To remember that with fiscal policy, it's true monetary policy too, but it's important for fiscal policy as well, that the benefits of expansionary policies are almost always short run, while the costs are long run. And we talked about concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, right? And the fact is that when policymakers and politicians engage in various kinds of policy, the benefits of that, right, they can do it, and the benefits of those policies appear in the short run, but the costs are long run. Deficits and debt, inflation, all these sort of problems that we're talking about take time. And so they can look good in the short run, and politicians often benefit from that. And politicians often don't pay the price in the long run for both fiscal and monetary policy. So again, you have to keep in mind that there's no such thing as non-political monetary and fiscal policy. Policymaking isn't tainted by politics. It's inherently political. It's political actors who are making those decisions. So with all this, I'll just say a word or two about the Great Recession. You can probably see the story, right? It turns out we had expansionary monetary policy after 9/11 through the early years of the 21st century. What was unique about this particular recession is that much of that expansionary policy got diverted into the housing market thanks to a whole variety of government policies that were artificially making housing more attractive. That caused house prices to rise. That created the market for all the crazy financial instruments and institutions that we saw. Those housing prices eventually had to fall. Why? The resources weren't there. People weren't saving. They weren't interested in waiting for the future. The resources weren't there to build those houses. Just like in our earlier story, the resources weren't there to do those things. Without the resources, the houses can't be built. The people in the finance and construction industry who are involved in them are going to get laid off. The houses are going to be abandoned. We see a recession, which starts in 2006, 2007, depending on how you count, and the stock market crash and the rest of the financial problems follow it. They don't cause the recession. They're a symptom. We then get the Fed stepping in to try to solve the problem, which it in fact created. There's big debates about what the Fed did and shouldn't and would have done. Those are ones that I'm going to kind of put to the side, right? But it's important to understand that the Fed portrayed itself as sort of rescuing us from the problem, but it was the Fed that created it in the first place, right? It's like, again, the arsonist starts a fire, runs out the building, throws on a firefighter uniform, and comes out and said, "I'll save you," right? But hey, it was your problem in the first place. So, a couple of things to conclude with. We might think about how can we change the rules of the game for fiscal and monetary policy in such a way that makes them less of a problem, right? And less likely to create these problems that we're talking about. Are there ways to bind fiscal policymakers to prevent them from running massive deficits? Are there ways to restructure the monetary system that take control out of the hands of discretionary powers out of the hands of the Fed, and subject that monetary system to tighter rules that prevent expansion of the money supply? These are questions that are addressed a little bit in the chapter, beyond the scope of this lecture, but really interesting ones to think about. So please make sure you watch the videos, the other videos, and other supplementary materials for this chapter. Make sure you give it a good read as well. I haven't been able to cover everything there, but I wanted to highlight some of the things that I thought were the most important.